At this hour, treacherous storms are raging across the South. Heavy winds, hail, and tornadoes knocking out power for tens of thousands of people as the state of Alabama warns residents they could see severe weather through the weekend. New economic numbers, U.S. retail sales rising in May, a sign consumers are still fueling the country's economy despite pressures of inflation. Plus, new details on that breaking news of a major cyber attack. What the U.S. government knows right now after several federal agencies were hit here in the U.S. And the powerful message from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in an exclusive interview with NBC News. His new details on the fierce counteroffensive from his country's military and the stakes for Russia in this latest battle. Our NBC News reporters are following all of the latest developments, and we begin with our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who sat down with Zelensky at the presidential palace in Kyiv for that exclusive interview. So, Richard, I know you spoke for almost an hour. Give us the headlines. What did he tell you?
So this was a wide-ranging interview, and it was his first since Ukraine has launched this long-awaited counteroffensive. So I first wanted to know, how is it going? For much of this war, Ukraine has been trying to defend itself, trying to defend the capital, trying to push Russian troops back from the major cities and prevent a complete Russian takeover. Now the situation is different. It is Ukrainian forces who are fighting against dug-in, entrenched Russian troops, and the Russian troops have mined their areas. It is proving to be very difficult to punch through the Russian defenses. And I think President Zelensky was quite candid. He didn't say that it is going with tremendous speed and that it is smooth sailing. He said already it is early days, it is proving to be very difficult, but he said for Russia, so much depends on this, that if Russia loses, it could lose the entire war. I also asked him about the political climate in the United States, because all Ukrainians are watching the debates happening in the United States right now, particularly comments from Republicans, including Republican presidential candidates, who suggest that too much money is being spent on Ukraine. Governor DeSantis said it's not in the U.S. In national interest to get more involved in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia. And former President Trump said that the United States is sending too many weapons over to this country, depleting American stockpiles. I asked for his response. In many ways, this country's very survival depends on the assistance of the United States, other allies, and several Republican presidential candidates are expressing concerns about support for Ukraine. What would you say to them?
What would I say? Is any candidate or senator who thinks it costs too much for the United States to support Ukraine, is he ready to go to war, to fight, to send his kids? Are they ready to die? Because anyway, they will have to do this if NATO gets involved. And anyway, if Ukraine would lose, if Russia would occupy Ukraine, Russia will continue going towards Baltic countries, Poland, etc. They will start war with one of the NATO countries. And at this moment, the United States will have to choose the collapse of NATO or go to war.
President Zelensky also had a dire warning. He blamed Russia for blowing up a dam in southern Ukraine that has flooded much of the region, displaced tens of thousands of people. It was a dam that was under Russian occupation. Russia denies that it destroyed the dam. President Zelensky said that he believes the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is also currently being held by Russian occupation forces, is the next target. And I asked him why Russia would possibly do something like that, why blow up a nuclear power plant and effectively creating a dirty bomb that would have catastrophic impacts on this country, but also potentially on Russia and the wider world. He thinks it's because, one, Russia is not interested in the security in this country, and two, that Russia, Vladimir Putin, might use something as horrific as blowing up this nuclear power plant in order to pressure Ukraine to stop its offensive and force some sort of peace talks that he thinks would be far too early and not in Ukraine's favor.
Some extraordinary insights at a critical part of the war. Richard Engel, thank you for bringing this to us. We appreciate it. Turning now to that cyber attack hitting U.S. government agencies, I want to bring in NBC's Dan DeLuce. Dan, do we know who's affected or who's behind it?
Chris, we still don't know a lot about this cyber attack. There are still questions about which federal agencies were hit, whether sensitive files were stolen or government systems disrupted. Now, last week, the FBI did issue a warning and said that there was a cyber criminal group called CLOP that was exploiting vulnerability in a popular software tool that's used to transfer files easily. And so it seems to be that would be the prime suspect in this case. Earlier today, Andrea Mitchell spoke to the head of the civilian cybersecurity agency, Jen Easterly, and here's what she had to say.
We're tracking it as a criminal group. Many of these criminal groups are located in places like Eastern Europe.
Right. And could it be Russian? Could there be Russian or state action behind it?
It's unknown at this time. Right now, we're tracking it as a well-known ransomware group.
So still a lot of unanswered questions about just how serious this attack is, but we do know that it's already hit the private sector, and many companies and organizations are now grappling with this problem. Chris?
Dan DeLuce, thank you for that. Now to the economy and retail spending outperforming analyst projections in May. CNBC's Morgan Brennan joins me now for CNBC on MSNBC. What do these numbers tell us, Morgan? And is Wall Street reacting?
Well, Wall Street is reacting favorably today because you're seeing stocks move markedly higher with the Dow up something like 1% right now. I think the bottom line here, Chris, is that the economy remains resilient, at least for now. Look no further than the retail sales number for May we got this morning. It rose unexpectedly, increasing 0.3%. That was after a similar increase in April of 0.4%. This was much better than the decline that economists had anticipated. And we saw consumers going out and spending on things like autos and furniture and gardening, as well as restaurants and services, which has been a bigger part of the spending puzzle in recent months. Consumer spending is about 2/3 of GDP. So when you see a strong reading like this that is focused on the consumer, it speaks to, as I mentioned, the underlying strength of the economy, and it will help support the economy in those GDP readings, at least for the current quarter. It also speaks to why the Federal Reserve yesterday, though, despite pausing and leaving interest rates unchanged at that meeting yesterday, also made it very clear that more interest rate hikes are on the table through the rest of the year if some of this data continues to remain so resilient. Not only high inflation readings, which are coming down and moving in the right directions, but still higher than the Fed's target, but also strong labor data, strong economic data, strong sales and consumer spending data like this as well. Part of the reason we are continuing to see this resilient spending is because the labor market is so tight. It has pushed wages up. It has given Americans more spending power to at least partially offset those higher prices that they're feeling out there. We saw that in the report today. And at least today, investors are reacting very favorably to it. Chris?
Morgan Brennan, thank you for that. Let's go to Alabama now, where many schools are closed because of dangerous weather. NBC's Kathy Park is live on the ground in Warrior, Alabama. Kathy, I'm seeing the power of Mother Nature behind you. What is expected going forward, and is the community preparing?
Well, Chris, I think the first order of business is to clean up this massive mess behind me. This is kind of an example of what we're seeing throughout the suburbs of Birmingham here. The homeowner tells me that this tree fell down this time yesterday. He was hunkering at home, sheltering in place as the storms barreled through. He said the rain was coming down so hard, he actually didn't hear these trees coming down. But take a look at this. Look at the root system here. I'm about 5'8". It's way taller than me. And also here on the ground is this marker, this yellow tube. Just a few inches underneath the ground there is a gas line. Fortunately, it didn't rupture. It could have been a whole lot worse, but Robert, the homeowner here, was kind enough to allow us on his property to kind of show you the damage here. Fortunately, speaking of damage, no damage to the home. It is unscathed. He did, however, lose 4 big trees on his property. Power outages still a big concern throughout the state of Alabama, especially south of where we are, in parts of Mobile and Montgomery. They are bracing for another round of severe weather, hail, damaging winds, also possibility of tornadoes as well. I just spoke with Alabama Power right now. Roughly 20,000 customers still without power. They're doing everything they can to kind of restore everyone by today. But of course, a big challenge is monitoring the influx of weather that is continuing to move into the area. Right now, fortunately, where we are, just outside of Birmingham, the sun is out. So hopefully some of these homeowners, these property owners can kind of get busy and clean up this mess. Chris?
Big job ahead. Kathy Park, thank you. A dozen contenders for the Republican presidential nomination. The newest, the mayor of the city where former President Trump was just arrested. Does he actually have a shot? We're back in 60 seconds.
I'm the only Hispanic candidate in both parties who's running. I think that's incredibly important because 20% of the country is made up of Hispanics that are trending Republican. And I'm focused on not just winning the 2024 election. I'm focused on creating a brand of politics that can win generational elections.
It's a long shot candidacy, to be sure, but maybe an indication that at least some Republicans see the inevitable Trump nomination as maybe not so inevitable anymore. Jonathan Lemire is Politico's White House bureau chief and host of MSNBC's Way Too Early. John Kasich is the former Republican governor of Ohio. Both Jonathan and Governor Kasich are MSNBC political analysts. And here at the table, NBC's Vaughn Hilliard, who has been covering Donald Trump. All right, Governor, you know I asked for you specifically because you were the first one who raised with me the prospect of a Suarez candidacy on this program. Clearly, you still have a few people in the Republican Party whispering in your ear. Look, here's the facts also. Never been a sitting mayor, elected president.
I'm like a Swami, Chris. I've got a little ball here. I can see the future. Just kidding.
Okay, well, I'm going to talk to you in a little bit about my lottery numbers. But back to Suarez. Never been a mayor elected president, although, people like Bloomberg have tried. In Miami, this is a ceremonial role. Does he have the gravitas to make a showing on the debate stage, let alone be president of the United States?
Well, look, I welcome him as a candidate, and my job is to just be, a referee here, an umpire, to call them like I see them. He's a young guy. Miami is happening. If you haven't been there for a while, you need to go. It's really cooking. And I had heard early on about the fact that many of the tech giants from California, the tech moguls, had decided that they liked Miami. It was a place to go. And so, he's been thinking about the future of business. And he's been promoting companies that represent the future, the digital types, the ones that understand AI and machine learning. And at the same time, he's got low crime and he's got relatively low homelessness in Miami, which is all interesting. And he's charismatic, so maybe he's running in 24 so he can run in 28. I don't know. I don't want to count anybody out, but it is a long shot. But Buttigieg, he made a name for himself, and perhaps Suarez will as well. We'll have to see.
Yeah, and ended up as transportation secretary. So there you go. Jonathan, look, Suarez's age and vitality do present a contrast, some would argue, to both frontrunners. They're at least 77 and 80 years old. There was this poll late last year, I remembered, that showed 3/4 of Americans prefer a president under 65. Look, every race hopefully has some substance, but there's also that intangible thing, right? Whether it's charisma, vitality. And yes, this year, is there any doubt, Jonathan, age is looking to be a real factor?
No, there's no question of that. And poll after poll suggests that Americans, even those Democrats who like the job that President Biden has done, do have concerns that he might be too old. They're not sure they want to see him run again. Donald Trump only a few years younger than Joe Biden. So, yes, age is an issue. This is indeed, though, a long shot candidacy. Some in the party had suggested to me, much like what Governor Kasich just said, this may be him trying to sort of get his name out there, which right now he has very low national name recognition, in order to set up a future run, 28 or even beyond that, because he is young and his political future does seem bright. But he's also emblematic of where the Republican Party at least elements of the Republican Party, want to go. They want to, first of all, showcase that Florida is a Republican stronghold now. And we've noted it's gone red the last few cycles, and that 3 candidates now, the mayor, as well as Governor DeSantis and Donald Trump, all call Florida home, all Republicans, as well as the idea of it becoming more Latino. The party has made some strides there, limited, but strides all the same in recent cycles. Donald Trump has shown some ability to win some Latino votes in the last cycle. So that's something that Republicans do feel good about perhaps going forward, but it's hard to imagine this candidacy really catching fire in the short term.
You know, if you look in the future, Vaughn, there's some talk. Maybe he's not really running for president. He's running for vice president. I know Kellyanne Conway is somebody who has suggested he would be somebody who would appeal to a younger demographic, who would appeal to the Latino community. What are you hearing from inside Trump world? I doubt, but tell me if I'm wrong, that they're like super worried that he poses a major threat, but who knows?
Look, he hasn't said that he is not running for the vice presidency. He has been asked that question. And I think one on the age fun fact is that he's actually a year older than the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, if we're looking at the age factor of all this here.
Okay.
Francis Suarez is interesting. The size of Miami, 440,000 population. South Bend, Indiana, a little bit more than 100,000 here. And when you're looking at Suarez's candidacy and the threat that it may pose to Donald Trump, there's been no statement from Donald Trump's campaign. The super PAC that is aligned with Donald Trump, the head of it put out a tweet saying, why is he running? It's not quite clear. I mean, I think the most national recognition that he's got to date was back in March of 2020, when he was one of the first elected officials around the country that got COVID. That's when I think the national population became more familiar with him. But in terms of his biggest challenge here over the next few months, it's going to be getting on that debate stage. He's got to find 45,000 Americans who donate to his campaign just to get on the debate stage with Donald Trump.
All right. So, Governor, most voters, again, don't know who Suarez is, but they will tonight because he's going to Reagan Library, a place that's very familiar for people who want to run for president. He's got one chance to make.
I've been there myself.
One chance to make a first impression. How does he take advantage of this opportunity? Is it a big opportunity?
I think it is. I mean, it's vision. You know, what I like about him is, like, he didn't vote for Trump or for DeSantis because he was concerned about immigration. Look, the Republican Party.
Well, but some would argue, as you know, that might be a problem for him because he made it very clear that he didn't vote for Trump either time.
Yeah, well, but I mean, he's saying he's an independent guy. He's not tiptoeing around his support for Trump, although I guess they say he's kind of warm to him. But look, I think it's an opportunity to project something much different in the party. Obviously, he's the only Hispanic candidate. He will talk about immigration, but he's also going to talk about job growth. He's going to talk about what he's done to reduce the crime rate. He's not going to spend his time on all these woke issues and all these negative things. If he's smart, he will look to the future. He will project to the future. He could be exciting, interesting, charismatic. He's the president, or was at least the president of the National League of Cities, which means you got to have your colleagues respect you. I'm not his campaign manager. I just find it interesting, and I had told you that I thought we were going to see something happen here. I don't know where this ends up, but it is certainly, to me, a breath of fresh air if he projects the way that I feel that he should do.
Okay, I'm just going to say I don't think you got that information from your crystal ball, but if that's your story, I'll let you stick to it. Jonathan, there are some questions also about Suarez legally. The Miami Herald has reported that he was paid, I think, over $170,000 by a local developer who got waivers from the city regarding a development project. And when I read that, and there's no conviction there, nothing like that. But I wonder if just the whole lens of what's disqualifying anymore has changed so much in the era of Trump that might not even really come up.
It may not come up, in part because it remains to be seen how much of a presence he'll really have in this race. But I think you raise an interesting question. Is we know the normal rules of politics have clearly, over the last 6-7 years, proven to not apply to Donald Trump. It remains to be seen, though, if they still do apply to everybody else. And in some moments they have. Other candidates still do get tripped up by things that Trump is able to shrug off, that he is still remarkably Teflon. And even the fact that his candidacy is still standing right now, where he's had not one, but two indictments and potentially more coming is a testament of that, of his resiliency, his shamelessness, perhaps some might say. And we've seen polls out in the last day or so that suggest that even after this federal indictment, the one out of Miami, his support has not shrunk at all. And in some state polls has even grown. So we know that Donald Trump seems to defy the rules of political gravity. It remains to be seen about the others. And now, to your point, some great reporting there from the Miami Herald, from the local Miami newspapers and journalists. Let's see now if Mayor Suarez does indeed really jump on a national stage, him undergo a national vetting, and see how he withstands that.
Jonathan Lemire, former Governor John Kasich, Vaughn Hilliard, thank you all very much. A special primary shaping up in Tennessee with two previously expelled lawmakers fighting to keep their seats, and an emotional day in court as closing arguments begin in the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting trial. We'll head to Pittsburgh next. Today in Tennessee, Democratic State Representatives Justin Jones and Justin Pearson are vying to keep their seats in a special primary election. Earlier this year, the Tennessee House, you may recall, voted to expel them for leading a gun violence protest inside the Capitol alongside Representative Gloria Johnson, although she was not voted out. The two were reappointed to their seats by local governments. NBC's Antonia Hilton is here with more. So what are we expecting today?
Well, Chris, today is really a test of whether these two lawmakers who have been catapulted into the national spotlight after all of the debate in their state over gun reform, whether they can galvanize their local constituents and remind them right now in the middle of the summer of this special election to come out and have their voices heard. You know, these are two, pretty Democratic leaning communities, Nashville and Memphis, respectively, some of the most diverse areas of the state. And so their camps, their supporters are feeling pretty good that these two are going to get their seats back. But it's been a long road for them. This initially was a major knock for them. They were, of course, there on the floor protesting and chanting alongside high school and college-age students, and gun reform ended up colliding with a whole host of other Democratic issues in the state there. And so the question right now is, how do they turn this national platform, this way in which Democrats in Tennessee, who don't normally get a lot of spotlight, but now they've turned it into fundraising dollars and support that, this party hasn't really seen there in a while. How do they really translate that now into a permanent a movement there? And so they need their supporters to come out and back them today so they can get back in their seats permanently, no longer on an interim basis, and push for issues like gun reform, abortion, police reform, of course, coming after the Tyree Nichols case in the state as well. And these are two of the only, people of color, youngest lawmakers there. So they have a coalition, a really young group of folks behind them who I think are eager to see them back there and representing that sort of part of Tennessee, their voice.
As you know, an off-year election, it's tough to get people out. A special election, forget it. But are they feeling pretty confident? Because they have gotten so much publicity and because there were so many people who felt empowered by what they did, that they are going to get the turnout?
Absolutely. That's a big part of it. The level of publicity, the way in which these young groups and organizations have come out behind the two of them in recent months. But there's also just the logistics here. I mean, Representative Jones does not even have a primary challenger on the Democratic side right now. Pearson does. But if he prevails, it's all but, a sure thing when August, the election, finally comes around.
Antonia Hilton, I know you'll follow it for us through. Thank you so much. Good to see you, my friend. Closing arguments just wrapped in the trial of the gunman who killed 11 people at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018. Robert Bowers faces 63 federal charges related to the shooting. He pled not guilty, but his defense team has acknowledged he carried out what was the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history. Joining me now from Pittsburgh, NBC News correspondent George Solis. George, if Bowers' attorney says he's the shooter, help us understand what's happening and what comes next.
Good afternoon, Chris. So our understanding is that the deliberations here with the jury might begin shortly, both sides completing their closing arguments this afternoon. Mind you, this is about 2.5 weeks of this case during the so-called guilt phase to determine whether or not Robert Bowers carried out this attack. The prosecution presenting about 60 witnesses, the most impactful, likely the final two, including the mother of one of the victims and an officer who was shot, who responded there to the synagogue the day of the shooting. The defense presenting no witnesses. And as you mentioned, during opening arguments, defense attorney Judy Clark saying there would be no dispute and no doubt that Bowers carried out this heinous attack, but they were trying to raise questions about his intents and motivation. But again, we are just learning right now that the deliberations may very well go underway for, the so-called guilt phase of this. If the jury does come back with a unanimous decision, this will then move to the sentencing phase, which is really what a lot of people say this case centers on, which is whether or not Bowers will receive the death penalty. And that is what there has been some division here amongst the community. Some people say he deserves the death penalty for this attack. Others saying he might be better served spending his rest of his days in jail. We've been hearing that testimony in this case has been very emotional in the courtroom. Some people reportedly breaking down in the courtroom, even in bathroom stalls, we're told. So you can just imagine how tense it is in that courtroom. But again, things reaching a new level with these deliberations. Whether or not we reach a decision today obviously remains to be seen. We are following this very, very closely. We'll bring you more updates as they become available, Chris.
George Solis, thank you for that. Did Boris Johnson deliberately mislead the British Parliament? The allegations laid out in a scathing new report is next. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken taking a critical high-stakes trip to China. What, if anything, can be accomplished? We'll head to Beijing. You're watching Chris Jansing Reports only on MSNBC. This week, lawmakers are expressing support for detained Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. A bipartisan group, nearly 36 senators, wrote a letter to Gershkovich expressing their anger over his detention by the Russian government. And on Tuesday, the House unanimously passed a resolution calling for his immediate release from Russian detention. Gershkovich was taken into custody in March and is accused of espionage. Both the Journal and the U.S. government strongly deny the allegation, with the State Department designating him as wrongfully detained. An appeal hearing against his pretrial detention is scheduled for next week. A scathing new report offers what the New York Times calls, quote, a damning verdict on the former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. After a 14-month investigation, a committee of British lawmakers concluded that the former leader deliberately misled Parliament over parties during the COVID lockdown in what became known as Partygate. I want to bring in NBC's Ali Arouzi from London. So, Ali, Johnson actually resigned from Parliament last week, apparently after learning of these findings in advance. So where does this go from here?
Well, Chris, it's a spectacular fall from grace for a man who only 3 years ago led the Conservative Party to a landslide victory election. And today he becomes the first former British Prime Minister in British history to have been found to deliberately mislead Parliament. That is a huge turnaround from 3 years ago for Boris Johnson. Now, in a 106-page damning report, MP said that he committed serial offences over these Partygate offences that he had personal knowledge of. I want to read you part of the committee's statement, if we can bring it up on screen. They say the contempt was all the more serious because it was committed by the Prime Minister, the most senior member of government. There is no precedent for a Prime Minister having been found to have deliberately misled the House. He misled the House on an issue of the greatest importance to the House and to the public, and he did so repeatedly. So these are very serious charges against Boris Johnson, and had he not resigned on Friday, Chris, he would have probably faced a 90-day suspension, which would have then triggered a by-election, which he probably would have lost, and this would have made this episode even more embarrassing for him. But unsurprisingly, the character that he is, he's come out swinging. He's accused the committee of being a kangaroo court that are stitching him up and putting the final knife in a protracted political assassination into his back. And whether this is going to kill his political career or not remains to be seen. He's weathered many, many scandals and political storms, and like a weighted Russian doll, every time he was knocked down, he bounces back back up. But these accusations of him and the findings are very serious. Much of his party has turned against him, and as one of the deputy leaders of the opposition parties here, the Liberal Democrats, say that the damning findings of this report will probably be the final nail in the coffin of Boris Johnson's political career. But again, it might be a little soon to write off a man that seems to be a Teflon politician, Chris.
Yeah, I don't know if he's had his 9 lives yet. Elliot Ruzzi, thank you so much for that. And with tensions rising between China and the U.S., Secretary of State Antony Blinken is preparing to make a critical visit to that country tomorrow, where he'll meet with senior Chinese officials and push for a thaw between the two global powerhouses. NBC's Janice Mackey-Frayer is in Beijing for us. So, Janice, how hopeful are both sides that any progress can be made here?
Expectations are quite low. The fact that the visit is even happening is the bit of progress here. It follows months of tense and often terse relations between the U.S. and China since that spy balloon was shot down, and Secretary of State Blinken called off a visit here hours before he was supposed to travel to try to reset relations. So in many ways, this is now the reset of the reset. And the relationship was icy even before the balloon. It's broken down even further over tech export lists, supply chains, Taiwan, Russia, and now these accusations of Chinese spy bases in Cuba. But it seems there has been just enough of a thaw to get both sides in the same room. And the conversation actually started a couple of days ago with a phone call between the Secretary of State and his Chinese counterpart, Qin Gang. He's the foreign minister here, a former ambassador to the U.S. Judging by the readouts from the conversation, it wasn't a warm one. The Chinese statement telling the U.S. to stop interfering in China's affairs and to stop harming China. So that's seen as setting the tone for discussions. But this is a very high-stakes visit, the first by a Secretary of State to China since 2018. Mr. Blinken will meet with China's President Xi Jinping. For U.S. officials, they say it's about managing competition and keeping the lines of communication open. For Chinese officials, they acknowledge that the relationship has encountered difficulties and challenges, but, quote, the responsibility is clear in that they blame the U.S. for sour ties. So bottom line is that neither side is expecting a breakthrough.
NBC's Janice Mackey-Frayer, thank you for that. And turning now to the latest on that tragedy off the coast of Greece, where searchers are skeptical of finding any more survivors after a fishing boat filled with migrants sunk yesterday. 78 bodies have been recovered. 104 people were rescued, but hundreds more remain missing. Officials believe the boat may have sunk because it ran out of fuel or had engine troubles as it was making its way from Libya to Italy. New developments today regarding that massive highway collapse in Philadelphia, where rebuilding efforts now stand, and how you can watch it live. That's next. The mayor of Los Angeles ramping up attacks on Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who just sent a busload of migrant families, including toddlers, on a 23-hour-long trip to California in what the mayor calls, quote, a despicable stunt. Local advocacy groups say there was no food or water on the bus, with children as young as 2 years old on board.
People were very tired, again, a little disoriented. But once we explained to them where they were, who we were, you could see people just kind of relaxing just a little bit more. And I just want to say we had a good interaction with all those, with the children, trying to make sure that they, their nerves were calmed a little bit.
So although they ended up in Los Angeles, our affiliate there reports at least one of the migrants has an upcoming court appointment in New York. Meanwhile, in Northeast Philadelphia, state and federal officials say it's not clear how long it will take to repair both directions of the collapsed I-95 overpass. NBC News correspondent Emily Aketa is at the scene for us. But Emily, one of the things they're going to do is they're going to tell people, if you want to chart the progress and see how we're doing, we're going to make that possible for you. Tell me what else is going on there.
That's right, Chris, and that live stream is actually already up and running. Hundreds of people tuning in at this hour. And what you're seeing right now is actually just the final stages of the demolition phase. And officials say that it's actually moving ahead of schedule in that regard. You'll see the cranes removing some of the final beams there before we start to see them fill the gap. Trucks dropping off a glass-based recyclable product that will fill the gap. They'll pave the area over with 6 lanes of temporary lanes and then rebuild the overstate, a more permanent portion around it, so that they can at least get part of the interstate up and running earlier. And there's a lot on the line when it comes to this project. When you think about the 160,000 vehicles that traverse regularly that part of I-95 that was essentially scorched to pieces from the fiery tanker crash we saw last weekend, well, 14,000 of those are trucks, and they're now facing more than 40 miles of detour, which impacts the supply chain. But it's not just truckers, it's also commuters. Here's more from someone who really relies and spends a lot of their time because of their job on the roads. Take a listen.
All of the cars that would typically be on 95 are now on these back roads in Northeast Philadelphia. My commute over the past 3 days has just been on roads that I don't even know. Like the past 3 days I've driven in areas that I'm like, I've done this job for about 4 years and I've never seen this area.
And NTSB investigators revealing overnight that the motor carrier, the company, is authorized to transport gasoline. It's still not clear why the driver lost control, crashing and unfortunately losing his life. Chris?
Emily Aketa, thank you for that update. Appreciate it. A new scientific discovery hundreds of millions of miles away now suggests we might not be alone in the universe after all. We'll explain after this. It may not be proof of extraterrestrials, but it might be the next best thing. Scientists now say they've found the essential building blocks for life on a moon 790 million miles away. Hakeem Oluseyi is an astrophysicist and author of A Quantum Life. So good to see you. Give us the basics. What have we found and where is it?
Well, what we're doing now is sort of looking for the ingredients of life. So when you talk about how NASA goes about looking for life, there were 2 themes. One theme was follow the water. So this small moon has a lot of water in cellulose. It has a subsurface ocean. And the other motto has been follow the energy. Life needs energy. So the tidal flexing of the moon provides the geothermal energy that life could use to power itself. But if you have the water and you have the energy, you may not necessarily have the ingredients. And life depends on these 6 simple elements, and all but one of them had been identified, and that's phosphorus. But studies showed that if there was phosphorus on this moon, then chances are it was locked in rocks and not available for life to use. And what this new study shows is that is not the case. The phosphorus is there, it's dissolved in the ocean, and so if there is life there, it can use it.
So what kind of life are we talking about? What could exist?
Well, if you look at how we use phosphorus in our bodies and animals use it, you've heard of these molecules that we use for energy, ATP and ADP, right? Well, guess what the P stands for? Phosphorus. But it's not just us multicellular animals that use it. Also, microbes use it. So the type of life we expect to find is microbial life. Multicellular life on Earth requires aerobic respiration, either photosynthesis, which is what plants do, or aerobic respiration, which is what animals do. And since no light can get to this subsurface ocean, then we don't expect there to be oxygen chemistry. We don't expect there to be photosynthesis. So you don't have enough chemical energy to power multicellular life like ourselves. So you can only have very simple life.
Still, it's awfully cool, and I don't want to get greedy, but Saturn has more than 100 moons. So if one of them has the necessary building blocks, could more of them also potentially support life? We just don't know it yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what's really shocking is that as we look out into interplanetary and interstellar space, we're finding the building blocks of life in not just these simple elements that are necessary, but also big molecules that are necessary. For example, all of the bases that make up our RNA and DNA have now been identified in space. So what we're doing is we're seeing that everywhere around us, the stuff of life is there. The water is there.
Wait. Are RNA and DNA?
Oh yeah. So the ATCG, you know, these letters that are the nucleotide bases, each of these complex molecules has been identified in space. And I'll tell you what's even interesting is that there is a lab that created what's known as a planet simulator up in Canada, and they've shown that it's really easy to create these lipid, you know, what our cell walls are, which by the way requires phosphorus, as well as RNA can be made spontaneously in nature. So this whole idea of how life started on Earth, one big idea is called RNA world, where it looks like that may be very easy to accomplish even on something like a tiny moon orbiting far away from the sun.
I never thought I could be so excited about phosphorus, but I actually am. Hakeem Oluseyi, you have such a cool job, and you're so fun to talk to. Thank you. It's great to meet you. That's going to do it for us this hour. Make sure to join us, though, for Chris Jansing Reports every single weekday from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern, right here on MSNBC. Our coverage continues with Katie Tur Reports right now.